Good evening and welcome to today's Ticonderoga Tuesdays webinar. Today's program is Archaeology at Ticonderoga, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. This Ticonderoga Tuesdays webinar is made possible in part by a grant from the Lake Champlain Basin Program. Before we begin our program this evening, I would like to orient you to help you get the most out of today's program on Zoom. We are using Zoom webinars, which means that both your microphone and camera are disabled during the program. You can use the Q&A function on the bottom menu bar to ask questions of our speakers. I will be monitoring those through the program and will ask our speaker as many of the questions as we have time for after each session. There will be a few occasions where our speakers will ask you to chime in during the program. If you'd like to answer verbally any of those questions, just use the raise hand function and wait until you see that your microphone has been turned on. To make the speaker's PowerPoint larger on your screen, you can hover your cursor between the space on the computer between the PowerPoint slide and the speaker's image. By clicking and holding on the tab that appears, you can move the cursor to the right and the PowerPoint slide becomes larger and the speaker's image smaller. Our next Ticonderoga Tuesdays webinar takes place on November 9th, when our focus will be on pre-service teachers exploring using historic objects with students. You can learn more about all of our upcoming professional development opportunities for teachers at our website at www.fortticonderoga.org and selecting the Learn and Explore tab. From there, select Educators. This evening's program is composed of two parts. First up will be Margaret Staudter, Registrar and Site Archaeologist here at Fort Ticonderoga, who will talk about the role archaeology has played at Fort Ticonderoga and how it will help us tell the important stories of Ticonderoga in the future. Middle and high school teacher Tim Potts will then share approaches and strategies for connecting your students with archaeology. So with no more ado, our first presenter this evening is Margaret Staudter. As I mentioned, she is our Registrar and Site Archaeologist here at Fort Ticonderoga. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree from Dickinson College and a Master of Arts degree from Durham University. Thank you for joining us this evening, Margaret.
Thank you. I just have a quick question. How is my screen displaying like really big at all?
No, it seems fine.
The normal, okay, so it's just on my end. There's some strange display occurring. All right, so let's get started here. I'm gonna share that. All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm very excited to talk about archaeology. It is definitely a passion and love of mine. And while the presentation, of course, has the past, present, and future title on it, we're going to be obviously discussing the archaeological work that's going on at Fort Ticonderoga, but also getting into a little bit about what archaeology is. And as teachers, how do we sort of approach using archaeology and the archaeological methods in teaching. So we're going to dive a little bit into the wonderful, exciting world of archaeology. Now, as Rich mentioned, I have a background in archaeology. I went to Dickinson College for undergrad and then Durham University in England for my graduate program. I worked on numerous field schools and have for the last few years been working in the collections department at Fort Ticonderoga, building up an archaeology program because there hasn't been any real sort of authoritative work done with the archaeology at Fort Ticonderoga up until this point by a staff member. So there's been some archaeological work done, which we'll be discussing, but really we're starting to just build up our archaeology program now, which is very exciting. So Rich mentioned that there's going to be some questions posed to you all if you would like to answer them. So the first two that I have for everyone is, what is archaeology and who is an archaeologist? So I'm just going to give you a moment to see if anyone would like to try to answer those questions. And there's no right or wrong answers. We'll be going over what it all means in a moment. And of course, Indiana Jones is sort of a right answer. It always seems to be the one that, of course, is most associated with our culture. The study of evidence left behind by earlier groups of people. Good, that's a good one. All right, I'll give it one more moment, see if anyone else has anything. Thank you, Rebecca. That's right on the money there. Okay, so we'll move forward. And And I have a little breakdown here. We'll go. There we go. Of what it all means. Oh, we got one more thing. Yes, looking at the past with artifacts. Great. So those two together really, thank you, Andrew. Those two together, I think, really make up what is archaeology. So it's the study of past human life through material culture. And our archaeology, the study of archaeology can be anything from footprints left by our human ancestors, and that might have been a news article that you all maybe saw recently about how I believe it was in Israel, though they found them footprints in quite a few different places, but human evolution and finding even just the littlest marks left by people thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. It could be building foundations, so Roman villas and the remains of castles, food residue and cooking pots. So a lot of times with different cultures that might not have left behind any written records, we're really using the material culture that is excavated out of the ground to be able to rebuild what the past lives of these communities were. And we certainly do that for pre-contact indigenous communities. They'll study the residue in cooking pots to see what these groups of people were cooking. Outhouses and trash pits, people's trash tell us a lot about them. And those are always two really big, exciting finds in the archaeology world. You have burial sites and skeletons tell a lot about the human condition and what how different people were surviving and what they were eating. We have plant remains. There's a whole section of archaeology which is this archaeobotany, so people that are studying the relationship between people and plants in the historic world. And then of course lots of things like shipwrecks and all the maritime archaeology as well. That's a great question. I'm going to answer that one in a moment. Where do archaeologists know where to dig? That is a good question. So an archaeologist, of course, is a person who studies that past human culture, and that's done through survey and excavation and analysis, with the aim of doing all of that. And obviously we're uncovering the past and that material culture through the ground, the material that's been left in the ground. And this also can be standing remains as well. So sometimes archaeologists are also, and this happens at the fort, we're studying the historic structures that are left behind. And that's sort of a blend sometimes of archaeologists and then historic preservationists and architects, so that there is some overlapping. Just like with archaeology, there's some overlapping with anthropology as well. And archaeology is actually a subset of anthropology, but archaeology is really looking at that past historic culture, whereas anthropologists often are sometimes studying the present. So, the use of languages, what people are eating and doing in the present day. And of course, all of this is being done in archaeology work with the aim of increasing our knowledge of the past, preserving historic sites and material culture, increasing accessibility to the artifacts, and then of course, as an education tool. Now, the question of where do archaeologists know where to dig? That's a great question. At the fort, it's due to a lot of factors. There's obviously areas where there's been standing remains or where you have earthworks or noted events that have occurred. You would think that people, if they've been there, will have left something. They'll have left a sort of I'm trying to think of a both scientific and poetic way to say it, but not necessarily a shadow, but there's that sort of ghostly presence of something that is left within the ground that means something or someone has been there. And sometimes that's because there's things still remaining above the ground that allows you to know it. And a lot of times it's through historical archives and evidence that way that we know, well, this map says that there was something here, so we can investigate it through different survey processes. And then sometimes you don't know where anything is, and then you have to go out and do a survey anyway before you excavate to see if you can find through test pits anything popping out of the ground. And there's a whole bunch of different methods in survey that I'll mention down the line, because I have a few pictures of some of that stuff being done on the site. But there's definitely an array of ways to know where to dig. Okay. So what is archaeology then at Fort Ticonderoga? Archaeology for us is the work on our historic buildings, so both the preservation of them, the restoration, the study of our historic buildings. So we are an 18th century military site. We also have a lot of evidence of pre-contact material and indigenous communities that were moving through the landscape, obviously being on Lake Champlain. Fort Ticonderoga, the Ticonderoga Peninsula was a really good means of traveling between what is now the New York side and the Vermont side of the lake. So we have then in the 18th century, a large fort that's being built. We have 19th century buildings on the property. We then have these buildings being restored in the 20th century. So we have our historic buildings, which are archaeological in nature. We have our battlefield, from both the 1750s during the French and Indian War, and then used again during the 1770s during the American War for Independence. We have the preserved earthworks that come with that. We have submerged cultural heritage off the coastline. So as I mentioned, shipwrecks. So in this case, we have some different cultural features in relation to the military history of the site. We have our artifact collection. So what makes up our collections department, of course, is a large collection of material culture. And a lot of those are archaeological pieces. We have survey projects that are being done. Excavation work currently on the site really is just done as needed. So we don't have large digs happening like you see at a lot of other major museums, because we have a lot of archaeological material from the past 100 years of us being as a museum that is currently being processed still. And you don't want to rip things out of the ground, because archaeology, one of the first things you learn as an archaeologist is that it's a destructive science. So it's a puzzle as you're going through it that you're piecing back together, but it's a puzzle that can really only be looked at once. So once you pull everything out of the ground and you remove all that dirt and that soil and all of your stratigraphy and your context, you can't put that back together. So a lot of our excavation work we do on the site currently is really mitigation work. So this is work that's being done in conjunction with projects that are going on to put in water lines, or we're doing restoration projects, or even things down to making sure that we're making some pasture area for our oxen. So very small projects. And then we have exhibits, of course, that display our archaeological material. We do education and outreach, so a presentation like this talking about our archaeology work. And then all of this is in the long run for stewardship, preservation, and accessibility. So looking at some of the past work and tying that into our historic buildings on the site, these are some stereo views and photographs of what the ruins of the fort looked like. So the fortification was used by the British. It was back and forth, first built by the French, taken by the British, sort of mid-French and Indian War, and then it was used by the British through the interwar period. It was captured by the Americans in 1755, and then the British again in 1777. So a lot of back and forth. And then by 1781, it was abandoned and it was bought by the state. And then it was in the possession of two colleges as a sort of money-making and preservation scheme. But then it was bought by a gentleman named William Ferris Pell. He bought the grounds, the lower grounds, which is where he built a historic house, or a house which is now one of our historic houses. And he also was then preserving the leftover fort buildings and the ruins. And this really allowed for their long-term preservation. There is, of course, many news articles and books and all sorts of archival evidence of people coming into the fort grounds right after it was no longer a military site and starting to find souvenirs and relics from the battles, and stowing away all of the pieces that they're finding. There you could actually show up as a visitor in the 19th century, and there was usually some family that was living on the property selling relics on a table. So it was, the archaeological evidence is starting very early on, but there also was some preservation occurring because the land was privately owned. But these ruins are restored in the early 20th century. So a descendant of William Ferris Pell, Stephen Pell, and his wife Sarah were really passionate about the fort's history, and with an architect restored the grounds. And if I go back and forth between the pictures, so this is our West Barracks building, our officers' barracks, which is in the further background of both of these two photos, sort of center in both of them. And you can see that there's portions of the building still standing. And what's really amazing and remarkable is that Alfred Boston, the architect, incorporated that standing architecture when he was rebuilding, doing the restoration in 1909 of this building. So if I take that material away, you can see it's a little hard to see, but the mortar in the original stone and fabric has that lighter mortar, and they incorporated that material into it. So there's still architectural material of the original fort that is available for us to study, which is really important. But they're doing a restoration based off of the research that they had at the time and what they thought was correct at the time. And there's been some variation that occurs with further research going forward. But this is one of our sort of first archaeological projects that occurs on the site. And they're also finding thousands and thousands of artifacts while they're digging out to do the rebuilding, which make up a lot of our archaeological collection today. Now, our battlefield and earthworks is one of the most recent projects that we've worked on. And we are just finishing up a American Battlefield Protection Program grant that started in 2019. And this allowed us to do a preservation and planning assessment of the battlefield. And through this project, we went through and did research on the battlefield, really looking into records, or I should say descriptions of the battlefield, but specifically the breastworks and then the earthworks, because originally they just started off as a very quickly built breastwork by the French in July of 1758. And then right after the battle, they are expanding it, and it becomes a series of earthworks that were then also used by American soldiers in 1777. So looking for descriptions of this battlefield, both during the battle, after the battle, well into the 19th century, doing an inventory of all of historic features and possible known features so that we can monitor them, but also think of future hypotheses for archaeological work. Mapping all of this into a GIS system so we can track everything, doing some COCOA analysis, which is a military terrain analysis that can get applied to historic battlefields, and then doing a condition assessment. So when we think about our stewardship and our preservation, making sure that the earthworks are going to be contained for years and years to come. And some of that has to do with managing the vegetation that's growing on them. So we contracted with the University of Vermont's Consulting Archaeology program. So they did a huge bulk of this work and helped us get maps digitized into the GIS platform, getting together all those historical references of the battlefield, bringing them all together. And then we also had their spatial analysis lab, UVM spatial analysis lab, come, and they did a flyover using an unmanned aircraft system that then was going to do some surveying of the site. So going back to that question about how do we know where to dig, where there's all this wonderful science that's developed over the last few decades of being able to really do a lot of remote sensing. That's using like satellite imagery. In this case, we developed a digital elevation terrain model. So it's going to read the elevation and pick up features that are on the property that we can then look back at our historic maps and see if they match up. So we did the flyover, and the data that we get then creates these models. So we can see the earthworks are popping up here a little bit, and then we can also match this to other types of elevation data, including LiDAR, which is a huge, heavily used data. And I'm sure you might have seen some more news articles, of course, are always really important archaeology news articles about LiDAR and other flyover imagery that has allowed for them to find hidden communities and temples and buildings in like the rainforest and different places all over the world that aren't habited anymore, but they've been able to find old civilizations and cultures by using this type of science, which is really wonderful. So this is our LiDAR, and then we can combine all these things together with our maps that have been digitized to then create these even further developed models that we can go into, and we can draw on them, we can take GPS points, we can track, and this is really all just going towards further developing the program, our archaeology program, with where we want to then be able to study specific sections of the site, maybe because there was an approach in one area and we think there might have been some occupation during this part of the battle, or they were building a redoubt in this area in May of 1777, and it's on our site on the property, and we want to know more about it. So we can bring all this data together, which is really, really important. One of the other things too that allows us to do, and this is part of that COCOA analysis, is look at what the landscape would have sort of reflected during that time period with those mapping skills, and say, okay, if a soldier was standing here, would he have been able to see the army approaching in this direction or in this direction? And then you can start to do projections of things like fields of fire and approach and withdrawal. And it really just keeps adding to developing for a large battlefield like ourselves, which is, gosh, I'm always going to get the number wrong, but it's like 2 square miles in circumference. It's a large section. There's no way to possibly excavate the whole thing, nor would you want to. So being able to create predictive models like this really allow us to figure out where we want to be excavating in the future. Now, we also have had work done on the site with our submerged cultural heritage. In the 1980s, they did an excavation of the Boscawen, which was a sloop built by the British in 1759. There was also a sister vessel to that that was actually dug up dragged out of the water in 1909 called the Duke of Cumberland. That doesn't exist anymore, but there's still some features that are underwater, and it's important to obviously check on them and make sure that they are maintaining. And usually a lot of vessels that are in water context, it does preserve them to a certain extent, depending on the waters, how brackish it is, and if there's currents and things coming. So it's good to make sure that their preservation is occurring, but it also is there for us to study the vessels and the material culture that's left behind in these contexts as well. So Lake Champlain Maritime Museum had done some work alongside Texas A&M and some other participants in the 1980s. And then we had the return of some of this crew, a new generation come by in 2019 under the leadership of Dan Bishop, who's down in the lower middle, who was working on his PhD at Texas A&M, along with staff from Lake Champlain Maritime Museum and the Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And what they're doing here, again, going back to our where do we know where to dig question, they are using survey techniques that are usually used in terrestrial settings. So ground penetrating radar, magnetometry. These are techniques that when you take this equipment across a landscape where you might not see anything, it's going to read if there's anomalies in the soil. So if someone has dug a ditch and it's gotten filled in, or if there was a house somewhere and the whole thing had gotten moved and it's just a nice big field of grass, there might be still a stone foundation in the ground. And this all can be read through using this machinery. And it's now just being adapted to watery settings, our maritime areas as well. So this is actually on ice. We were walking out on Lake Champlain using that equipment to see if we can get any readings of anomalies down underneath the water. So we did that in the winter, and then they returned in the summer to do a survey to check in on any of the material culture that was still down there, but also to see if they could go back and some of the anomalies that have popped up using that equipment, what exactly they were. And the really one big one that they had gotten excited about turned out to be just a pile of coal clinker that was in relation to the steamboat dock that that was once upon a time off the side of the fort, and was a way that a lot of visitors came up to the ruins in the 19th century. And that's eroded away and gone for the most part. But there was a big pile of coal clinker that had, with that equipment, created a signal of some type of metal resistivity occurring. And it ended up, it wasn't anything as exciting as I thought it was, but instead of a big pile of coal. Was there anything on the site before the British Native American remnants? So as far, there has been some study of Native American culture on the site. It's something that we're really just starting to move into with our collections department, which is really, really exciting and really important. As far as we know, there wasn't any at the moment, like true Native or Indigenous settlement. They seem to really have used the property more as a thoroughfare going from the New York side over to the Vermont side. And on the Vermont side of the lake, just a little bit inward and along the coastal sections, there are a lot of very well-known pre-contact settlements, some of them which I think had actually very long periods of occupation occurring. But as far as we know right now, we do have projectile points that have been found. We find some even just in some of the excavation work that was done in the early 2000s, which I'm going to talk about. But as far as we know, no long-term settlement. We do have Native communities that were involved during the French and Indian War and the American War for Independence. And hopefully in the future, maybe we'll be able to find some more archaeological context from them. But right now, since most of our archaeological work, or the material cultural, I should say, a lot of it was dug up in the early 20th century during the restoration without any context being recorded. They're just digging things. We don't really know if we can match all that history up quite yet, but hopefully in the future we'll be able to know more. All right. So artifact collections, as I was just mentioning, we have both our restoration period artifact archaeological collection, and then we have our sort of excavation methods that have occurred on the property. Most of these done in conjunction with large projects that have been going on before I was ever working at the fort. And one of the largest project that has ever been done was due to the building of the Mars Education Center. And this is an area of the site that was still a ruin. It had a little bit of work done on it. I think really destabilization so that people could visit. And Rich, you might even be able to speak a little bit better to that than I can, and Tim as well, since I've only seen it in photographs. But this was where the Magasin du Roi, or the King's Storehouse, was, the powder magazine as well, built by the French. And then when the French were retreating in 1759, they blow it up. So it wasn't rebuilt in the same way that the other two buildings, the West Barracks and the South Barracks, were. And they wanted to rebuild it. So in order to do that, there had to be excavation work done. And this was done in the 1990s into the early 2000s. And then the building was finished in 2008. But one of the big projects that was done this year was cataloging our parade ground material. So I have this image from one of the reports that was done by a contract archaeology group. So this wasn't done by any staff. Maybe the staff might have jumped in a little bit here and there. There was one long-term volunteer staff member that was helping them. But for the most part, this was done by a contract CRM, Cultural Resource Management Archaeology group. So they were out in the parade ground, so stretched out to the right of that building, doing a lot of work. And this summer we had our two Edward W. Pell fellows, graduate fellows, excuse me, helping us catalog that material. And we have 36 boxes. So they made it around halfway through, which was really excellent, just for this project alone. So they were cataloging it, and it's really wonderful because our archaeological material, obviously when it's taken out of the ground without any stratigraphic context, it is missing some of that puzzle. It's not the full story, but the artifacts still can tell us quite a bit about the culture and the people that were there, and what they were using and what their needs were. And some of the amazing artifacts that they found through this project were pieces of pottery and different types of pipes, clothing adornment. So in this image, we have a shoe buckle, or it might be a knee, I think it's a breeches buckle, sleeve buttons, regimental buttons. So regimental buttons are always an excellent way, though it can be a little misleading sometimes, to tell us which regiments were there, or at least we know on paper which regiments are there, but then we have the physical evidence of it. There's this wonderful brick, most likely a French brick, that has this encrowned or emblazoned heart, and that's very much popular with French Catholic imagery. So just really speaking and expanding to the lives of the people that were here in the 18th century. Now, that was all of our artifact cataloging, and that's one of our really big projects that we've been working on, is our cataloging. As I mentioned, we don't want to bring anything else out of the ground until that material is taken care of. But we also have survey work being done, and survey is that first step. So as we go forward, wanting to do more archaeology work on the site, survey is really the first step. And this is where you go out and you map, you make notes, you can do ground truthing, you can do test pits. We're also monitoring areas that have to be dug for big projects, so that we can always go back, and answer those questions with further excavation in the future. So survey is one of the first big steps when any archaeology work is occurring. Now, excavation does have to happen if you need to open up a larger area of your ground so you can answer questions, or you might want to be doing more research. And one of the projects that I had to work on over the last few years, and again, this is just mitigation work, so we didn't plan to do this archaeology work. It had to happen because of the restoration, in this case, of the pavilion. And I mentioned earlier, the land had been bought by William Ferris Pell in the early 19th century, and this was his home. And then generations later, it was Stephen and Sarah Pell, our founders' home, and it was recently restored. So we had to do work around the grounds to update the water systems and the electrical, bring in all sorts of different new modernization to the building. So there had to be groundwork done. And we did some test pits beforehand. Up on the top left, we found part of a foundation for a fireplace from the early 20th century that they had only had there for a while. And then it seems a few decades later, they had ripped it down. We have tons of 19th century material culture that was popping up, because that, of course, is the largest occupation period of the house. It went from being a private home, but then also a hotel, and then back to a private home. So we have a lot of bottles, beer bottles, glasses, eating equipment, everything that, especially like mostly eating and drinking things that you would assume people would be wanting hanging out at a hotel. So in the middle, we have a porter bottle or an ale or a ginger beer bottle. They were being made in Great Britain in the late 19th century, and we have quite a few of them, but this is a full one, which is really exciting. We have parts of pipes. We have a lot of different types of ceramics, lots of transferware, which was one of the most popularly produced and consumed types of ceramics in the 19th century. And then in removing part of the floor of the old kitchen, we found a well underneath it. And we did some excavation work on it. And we didn't really, interestingly enough, it was a dry laid well. We tried to do a little bit of testing by doing some like core testing as best as we could of the center of it. And we didn't get a lot of archaeological information. There wasn't a lot of artifacts to help date it, and not even around it. So that was then filled in and preserved so that in the future, if there is ever more time to investigate it, it's been preserved and it can be done. So that was our excavation work. That's probably the most extensive excavation work that we've had on the site. But we're doing it and we're recording it and making sure that we're following the best practices, and we can keep building on our archaeology program going forward. Now, one of the other things I mentioned was exhibits and education and outreach, and that's taking then all of this work that we're doing, our material culture, the excavation material, and then really being able to share it in a way for visitors and educators and students. And one of the exhibits that we have at the fort is called Object Lessons, Perspectives on Material Culture. And it has non-archaeological items, and it also has some archaeological items. So this is where I'm going to ask you guys a few more questions to see if we want to answer them, do a little participation. This is one of the items in the exhibit. It is a, hopefully it's probably not a spoiler too much, but it's a saucer and a cup. And the theme of this exhibit is looking at 4 different parts of investigation into a material culture piece. So we're looking at art, function, manufacture, and culture. And with art, this is where it's interesting because I haven't really gotten to this discussion with our curator, but art and culture, I think, can sort of, they move in and out of each other. One sort of instigates the other or influences the other. But with art, we're looking at obviously elements of individuals and culture that are being incorporated into the object. Function is, what is the purpose of it? What is the purpose of this object? Why was it made? Manufacture is how it's being made. And then culture is the reflection of the people around this object and how that, again, influences why the object might look like it does. So that being said, I want you guys just to think for a moment about those 4 themes or factors and how we could apply it to these 2 objects. And if you would like to come on and say anything vocally, or you want to type in the chat, what do you think for this? What are the questions? If you were, as a teacher, posing this to a student, what would you want them to be thinking about looking at this object? And we'll be going over it in a moment. So I'm just going to give you guys a second to see if you want to answer. And again, you don't have to participate, but there is the option. While you're doing that, actually, I'm going to take a quick drink of water. Okay. All right, we're going to go forward. Oh, everyone. Yes, so those are the questions that we want to be asking, and then having some of the students answering is what the materials were made out of, what was it being used for? Yes, so what is the function of the objects? So function, yep, would be falling into that category of what are the types of ways it's being used? How is it similar to something in your house today? And that's really good, actually. That's a something we'll talk about. I'd like to talk about when Tim starts his discussion about how there's applications for archaeology with students. Great. What materials is it made of? How is it made? Okay, so we're gonna those questions of art and function, manufacture, and culture. Now we're gonna look at the object and see how those things get applied. Okay, so this is a lot of text, but I'll spell it out for you guys. So historical context for this object is that in July of 1759, the British arrive at Fort Ticonderoga and they capture Fort Carillon. There had been a large battle in 1758. The British vastly outnumber the French, but the French have this miraculous victory. And then the British return the next year, wised up, and the French know that they can't do it a second time in a row. So they end up abandoning the fort, but before they do, as I mentioned, they blow it up. And this was an intense fire. It burns for around 5 days. And because of this, we find objects archaeologically that have had influence of heat and destruction. And they're great objects to find because, especially in an archaeological context, there will be certain objects that, like a coin that has a certain date and it can't be produced before the date on the coin. So everything that you find below it is going to be earlier, and everything that you find above it is going to be later, unless there's been some strange intrusion that's occurred. So when we find, hopefully in the future, or in this case, because this, I believe, object was found during that early restoration period, which didn't have any context in the ground. But when we find things as we dig through the ground stratigraphically going by time, we'll be able to find something like this that has a very certain day or days that this occurrence would have happened to this object, and then be able to time frame around it. So this is these are 2 pieces of tin glazed earthenware. In France, this is called faience ware. It was incredibly popular. You see it a lot as lighter colored pieces, but we also have very popular brown, dark brown pieces that are being produced. The exterior of them have a lead glaze, and then the interior has a tin glaze. And tin glazed earthenware was one of the most popular sort of production items in Europe and in England in the 18th century. And the brown was a little less expensive. So we know that brown especially was being produced in France. So if you found this object and you would be able to identify it as tin glazed earthenware, you would know it was most likely coming from France in that period, and most likely from the area of Rouen. That's a more specific aside. What's the function? It's a cup and a saucer, and it's been glazed. So that means that the surface is impermeable and it's meant to hold liquid. So when you look at your terracotta flower pots, those are not glazed. So the water seeps out of them. You want that for your plants. But when we eat off of our plates and cups and bowls and things today, as you mentioned, if you had students looking at what was in their house, that's similar to these objects. They're all glazed so that we can eat off of them. And in the 18th century, coffee and tea and hot chocolate were incredibly popular. So someone's going to want the function of having a cup to drink those things out of. The manufacture, so how were these things being made? The cup was thrown on a potter's wheel. The plate was likely done in a mold, and they've been fired. So they're first fired to a biscuit, so it's just fired without anything on it. And then it goes through a glazing process to make sure that you get that finish on it that allows someone to eat off of it, and also helps it become a little bit more indestructible with that glassy finish. Now, the culture is that both vessels have been cracked. So in terms of a time period, they've gone through that fire. They've been part of a military context at the fort, and they were there during the capture. What's really cool about the saucer, and I'll go back for a second, is that blue sort of smudge on there is actually a piece of melted glass. That's how hot the fire was. So something melted on top of it. And because they're French in origin, they were most likely then used somewhere between 1755 and 1759 by the French who occupied the fort, the soldiers, and was there when the powder magazine blew up. So we can look at our historical objects, our archaeological objects in all these different ways. And these are great questions to be able to pose to students when they look at an artifact, and not just say, oh, it's just this thing and it's this color. You can really start to break down different components of where it came from, why was it used, how was it made. Now, with our stewardship and our preservation and accessibility, it's really important for us as a museum that we are respecting our archaeological collection and making sure that it's around for our staff and our scholars and our educators today, but also for future generations. And this is one of our past Edward W. Pell Fellows, Casey, who is working on rehousing our button collections. So we have over 2,500 buttons, and they have been stored, as archaeologists like to do, in just bags. We put a lot of things in bags. But these are metal buttons, and they're fragile, and they've come out of the ground, and some of them don't have a lot of sort of rigidity to them anymore. Some of them are just like the top of a button, and they've been pressed and have designs on them. And as they're crunching together in a bag, that's not going to last very long. So she did this beautiful rehousing project, and this allows for their preservation, but it also means that they're more accessible, and they're more accessible for people to see, and they're more accessible for people to take out and research, which is really important. And again, these are artifacts from our grounds, and they tell our story. And similar to excavation itself with our artifacts, if we don't take care of them and they're gone, then they're gone forever. Now, we also do a lot of accessibility because obviously people live in different areas of the country and areas of the world, and not everyone can visit Fort Ticonderoga. And so we try and share a lot of our work through social media. The fellows this summer did posts that shared some of the excavation material, the artifacts that they were working on with that parade ground project. And we try and do weekly posts where we share maybe some of our cataloging work or different highlights from our collection through social media, so Facebook and Instagram and sometimes Twitter. And then we have a lot of records, object records that are going onto our Ticonderoga online collections database. And this contains pictures and a description with our archaeology information. Sometimes will tell you the project that it's come from. And this is a website that can be used worldwide. And it's a website that we've used, my supervisor, Miranda Peters, has used, and our curator, Matthew Keagle, to use as sources for educators, for researchers. And the more that we put on there, the more that our collection then becomes broader for more people to see. So we put a lot of our archaeological material on here so far, which is really great. And there's that knee buckle that was cataloged this past summer and is now up on our online collections database. So that's it for me for right now. But here is my name and my email address if anyone ever needs to talk to an archaeologist or has any questions, and we can also always follow up with that information. That is our online collections database URL. And again, we can also email that out. It's also available on our website. And I believe Rich and Tim are going to maybe bring that page up to share with you as well. So I don't know, Rich, if you want to do questions now.
Actually, yeah, if you want to go ahead and answer that question that just came in.
Sure. Was there any Chinese, Arab, or other non-French or British artifacts found showing trade route access? Yes, definitely Chinese. I'm not sure of any Arab or sort of Middle Eastern, but we have a lot of Chinese export porcelain that was being very much used in European and British context. And of course, those individuals then coming over, bringing that with them. But then by even by the early first colonization, within a few decades, people are bringing over all sorts of different trade items, and that the materials being sold and bought in all the colonies. So I don't want to say it started in the 1750s, but on our site by the 1750s, especially with the British, they are using a lot of Chinese porcelain, and a lot of that's actually available. Our archaeological pieces are available on the online collections database. There's some very beautiful teacups and bowls, and it's really cool to see the influence of Chinese export porcelain then on the ceramic trade within Britain especially, and France as well, and how they're using a lot of the similar patterns. Any historical surprises you can share you learned from archaeological study of the site? I don't know if there's any surprises quite yet, because we haven't done, more of the archaeological surprises we get is just from studying right now the collections and learning more about them and seeing the different pieces that we have, because we haven't done a lot of large scale excavation yet. I think it's not a surprise, but it's just exciting is all of the survey work we've been doing with the University of Vermont and creating those maps. And I think that's where some of the surprises will come in the future, is as we're really starting to compare our historic maps with the elevation models, we'll be able to hopefully see some things about our property that we didn't know before. It's probably the best answer right now.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. And Margaret's going to stick around with us. So if you think of other questions near the end, we can follow up with any additional questions for Margaret. Um,
All right, thank you.
and yeah,
Thank
thank you, Asim. I was
you.
just looking up where you were from because Tim Potts, our next speaker, was asking where you were from. So Illinois, we have people from New Hampshire to Oregon. I know we have people in Texas and Missouri joining us this evening, and of course, New York. I would like to now introduce Tim Potts. Tim has taught middle and high school social studies for the past 30 plus years for the Monticello Central School District in the Catskill region of New York. He is a past president of the New York State Council for the Social Studies and is currently the serving treasurer of that organization. And Tim has done a lot of work with me and with my colleagues at Fort Ticonderoga over the last 15 plus years in working on teacher professional development opportunities. So thank you and welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Rich. Good evening, everyone. Some of you all know me quite well because you are veterans of our sessions. So hopefully I'll have something new for you. Before I forget, Andy Demko from Oregon posted a question about the object lesson with art function, manufacture, culture. We have different, that isn't fully formalized on the website from recollection. I asked Rich about that. We have some versions of that. We are also working on a pre-service piece related to that there might be a short video clip that we may be able to share with you. But the upshot is at some point, I'll get some material and some images that I've taken. I don't have those photos readily available, but it's on the third floor of, yeah, right, Rich, the third floor exhibit is still there. So we'll get something together for you for that. So with this opening slide, just a plug for the fort. This is actual items from the collection. This is about 11 by 17 cardstock style poster that is for sale through the fort. It's a great piece if you were to put students in groups. I had an epiphany today about this poster. I said, you know what, I'll open with it. So it's available. A lot of these items are in the collection database, and it's a great piece to have in your room now that most of us, well, all of us are probably back fully in the classroom. So I want to spend a few minutes with you, a little bit of time here talking about some perspectives that I have developed over the years of teaching. I want to be upfront. I am not an archaeologist. I am not an avocational archaeologist. I just have a little bit of exposure due to some circumstances in my career. One being a former colleague that is long retired that I was able to spend my first decade with. And that colleague was a avocational archaeologist and a person responsible for a lot of inventorying of artifacts in a summer setting. And this individual was very fortunate and still owns property at the base of Mount Independence. And so while I started my career back in the 1990s in the Catskills in Monticello, New York, my colleague would come back after a summer worth of digging and pre-internet show me a lot of 8.5 by 11 photographs of a lot of the artifacts that were discovered at Mount Independence across the way on Lake Champlain from Fort Ticonderoga. And this was my exposure to archaeology. And I don't want to say that I was trained, so to speak, but she was very instrumental in teaching me different things, instrumental in kind of separating fact from mythology when it came to archaeology. Also encouraged me to kind of have a skill set in my teaching about archaeology. Now, we are all aware that our curriculum is, and for a lot of us, is a mile wide, inch deep. So although archaeology is nice, it's sometimes hard to incorporate in your state standards. It's sometimes hard to find appropriate places because of the responsibilities that you have in getting through curriculum. We know that that's not the best way to teach. So if you're in an environment where you have a lot of flexibility, and then you can go at it. You can create a lot of unique lessons. If you're not going to let the mile wide, inch deep stuff bother you, then great. Figure out those chunks of time that you can use it. So I want to talk about a few things that you can do. Um, I don't think anything here today is earth shattering, but there's some things to mull over depending on where you are in your career, if you're starting out, or if you're mid-level, or if you're at the veteran stage. So one thing my colleague heavily stressed to me from her opinion was that most of the commercial pedagogical resources out there, now granted that was 20 years ago, she was very skeptical of. She said, really look at those carefully. A lot of times those are not vetted by trained archaeologists. So a word to the wise, when you are looking at commercial resources, either online or in book format, take a look at those. Take time to decide what it is you want to do with those particular resources. And sometimes things that you think are okay become dated quickly. Things don't always have the best terminology in them. And then some things can be spruced up by you. Some of those things can be spruced up by internet material. And I'll give an example of that happened for me during, I guess you'd call it COVID teaching time that most of us all went through. And then, create your own mindset about that. What is it that you want to get across? Most of my career was spent with middle schoolers. I'm in a high school setting now. I've taught every grade from 6th to 11th. And of course, the middle school students, it's all about the find. It's all about, what artifacts can be located. Not so much about preservation, not so much about conservation, not so much about how much things cost. So those are great things to debate with students. Sometimes it's best to leave things in the ground because they don't look at it from that perspective. They are more instant gratification. They want to deal with, seeing that artifact. It should be on display. And some of the most exciting times with students have been with specific artifacts. And I will talk about a couple projects that I have done over the years where they were able to go see certain things. So one of the most simplest ways, let's say that you're dealing with a very robust curriculum and you don't have time, I would just put archaeological things built into your daily do nows, tie it in with a particular unit. It could be on the French and Indian War. Go on YouTube, find some very basic video clips that may be archaeologically related. I would caution you not to be negative net all night, but be careful of YouTube. Some of the videos aren't the best on there with archaeological practices. Maybe vet them through an archaeologist, have them take a look at it if they have time. And I'll talk about how you can network with different archaeologists. But that's one of the best ways that I have tackled archaeology, or either my video do nows, 2 to 3 minute clips, or a daily written do now, whether that's vocabulary based. If I'm trying to deal with stratigraphy, do I show a static stratigraphy drawing and have them look at that? For those of you that have state assessments, for some reason, as bad as it sounds, stratigraphy drawings always come up, so to speak, in some of the state exams. And I don't know what their obsession with that is, but that's a way to tackle that. So at a base level, I would encourage you to think about that. And maybe you do that already. But if you do, then I would encourage you to switch over to video do nows and find those quick clips. This is a resource that I've had for a while. It says 4th through 7th. It was done in the 90s. It was called Intrigue of the Past. It's through a website called Project Archaeology. It's easily located on the web. There are 28 lessons in this book. I could not find a PDF of it online. It's inexpensive. It is dated. I want to be transparent about that. It is dated in some areas, but there are areas where if you feel qualified, you could update the lessons. I have I have access to some of the lessons. If Rich is going to connect with you after this and be able to send you certain things. So there are some great classification lessons in there. There's also some good stratigraphy based layers type lessons that are in there. So that's a resource that it could be usable. But again, it has a little bit of datedness to it. And there's plenty of links online for updated sites. Some of the materials are free, and then some of them, of course, want you to pay for them. So let's talk a little bit about archaeology hooks. Margaret mentioned Indiana Jones, and I know for the most part, this becomes somewhat dated. Before I switched over to high school, I had a couple standard lessons, and one of them involves Indiana Jones. I have some high interest articles that came out through some, at the time, some middle school publications. Students would pre-read those, and then I would spend a little bit of time talking about this movie. Before I switched to high school, most students did not know about Indiana Jones. So they're like, what are you talking about? And so I would use this particular scene with this golden idol, as he calls it, as a great hook to discuss classic style archaeology from the 20s and 30s, and the focus on treasure hunting and in tomb raiding, so to speak. I would talk about Tomb Raider a little bit. Some kids have that focus. When the movie Mummy came out, that had a little bit of overplay. So these are movies and clips that you could use as a hook per se. The Indiana Jones worked really well when I taught sixth grade, because I had a full scale project, which I will talk about right now. I created a lesson, which I can send, it was called an archaeological or archaeology book project. And it was a spin-off from Dinah Zykes foldables. The book had to be physically interactive. So they built the book, they created all their own pages. This was an individual assignment. I didn't do any group projects with this, where they were really delving into classic versus modern approaches to archaeology. And I would use the movies like Indiana Jones as a way to kick that off. And I don't have any pictures. I tried looking in my vast photo collection of some of these. Some of these were incredibly done well. Pretty much every page was interactive. There were charts, graphs. Some kids did pop-ups. I did do a mini lesson on that. This was definitely done during high stakes testing era. I was able to build the time in. So this wasn't, La La Land of the 90s. When I came into teaching, it was all about the art of teaching. So this was definitely done under a pressure time. And I know what that is in New York State. I have 3 classes that I teach that are all Regents bound. So I know what it is to be under pressure on a gateway exam. The other thing that I did that is related to this, I don't have a separate slide to this, is we took our 6th graders to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And this is a project that I'm going to mention that you can do in any area as long as you've got a decent museum. Same thing, Night at the Museum is another older style movie that not all kids know about, but you can rip that off. And what I did with my students then, 6th grade in New York State is pretty much an Eastern, kind of an Eastern / world civ style course. I broke my students into different teams. I had an Egypt team, I had a Mesopotamia, I had an Indus River, Rome, Greece, all of it. And they had to go research artifacts that, in essence, if they came alive, what would they teach you? And so at the time, phones were developing with cameras. So some students had phones, then we had regular cameras. That was probably one of the best projects I ever did, because they got into it. We did a lot of pre-research before we went. They knew that this wasn't the Cokes and Doritos trip. They knew that they were going to work. I spent a lot of time scaffolding that it was a work day. And so when they got to the Met, they knew what they had to do. Some of the kids really couldn't contain their enthusiasm when they got back and they were uploading their images. Some of them were not normally excitable kids. Some of them had very bad home lives. This was the first time they had gotten out. They hadn't been to the city in a while. And so when they were able to really teach about the 10 artifacts that they chose, and be able to explain them and explain the history behind them, and they had to read all the and photograph the exhibit material. That was a very teachable moment in that. And I didn't have a problem ripping off Night at the Museum. And so that's another lesson that I can share with my rubrics and how we graded it. That was a little bit more interdisciplinary with my colleagues. We had a team approach on that when we graded that. So that was more of a team-based project because that was a culminating trip. It just, I was fortunately able to push the envelope and have it be a social studies driven project. But social studies teachers can be like that. We are driven people. So during COVID, I want to share some things that I did with that. One, I get a weekly set of emails from Smithsonian Magazine, and these are those emails that woulda, coulda, shoulda, you'd like to get to, and they pile up in your inbox, and then you delete a whole bunch. But I don't delete these anymore. They come in probably 2 to 3 times a week. There's like a weekly digest that comes at the end of the week. If I'm correct, those come in on the weekend. And these are incredible. I found many high interest, readable, they're not like Newsy LA where they're, leveled, but they're accessible. They're accessible to middle school and high school. Some of them you might have to do a little bit of vocab work with, but once they annotate the article, these were great. My district's a Teams district, a Microsoft district, so I was able to build these into my forms, which is basically like a Google form type of thing. And I was able to put all my hyperlinks in there and put in my word banks, et cetera, build my questions from low level to high level. And, just today, I'll give you an example. Today, one of them came in 3 mainline articles about archaeology, one having to do with a 500-year-old nautical shipwreck from the found, they believe, sunk in the summer of 1495 near Sweden. I haven't tackled that article yet, but nautical archaeology is important too. I know I'm talking mostly land-based type things, but another one, a crusades encampment in Israel, just in today's email. And then a 1,500-year-old ivory beard comb found in Germany. Little esoteric there, but some of these articles are pretty layered. Some of them get into metal detecting. I know that can be controversial. Some of them, the metal detecting ones, had to do a lot with coins, and they were mostly students that are teenagers doing this, finding some incredible things that have changed history. So that's interesting. I had a lot of kids asking questions about that. And a spin-off of this is a group called Face Lab. They are in Europe. And although this isn't, outright archaeology, it has a connection to it. And it's the facial reconstruction. And this gentleman is called Abbot John, a medieval abbot that they have spent a lot of time looking at the bone structure. Students find this absolutely fascinating. I probably got the most amount of questions and feedback in relation to this Face Lab concept. There are a lot of other places around the world that do the same thing. Students do like the concept of being able to potentially see what scholars believe the person looked like. I don't personally know what the percentage of accuracy, but that would be a great discussion point. That would be something for your students to research. Is this accurate? Is this legit? Is this a legit science, so to speak? I know recently, same thing, Smithsonian, they did a face lab style presentation of 3 um, Egyptian mummies and what the 3, in this case, males, look like. Perfect thing for an Egypt unit, perfect to get that kind of discussion. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that type of stuff. I should say stuff, that type of spin-off in relation to archaeology. Another thing that was really important going back to my colleague from about 1990 to 1999 was the idea of joining archaeological organizations, or at least networking with them, inviting an archaeologist to class if possible, or virtually. Hint, hint, invite Margaret to your class. And the idea of when I came out of my undergrad work, I was pretty well prepared because I had a unique degree program that was about 85% content classes. All of my professional education courses were done in one professional semester because that was the focus of the degree, to develop teachers that really had content. So yes, I felt somewhat qualified, but I wasn't fully there. So I spent a lot of the 90s going to academic conferences, and that's how I linked up with Fort Ticonderoga, and probably about 1997 or so, maybe 90, yeah, about 97, and was looking for specific things on the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. So I would encourage you to do that. I also, at the same time, was able to go to some archaeology conferences that were in the Lake George corridor. At the time, there was a lot of movement of stuff going on at Fort William Henry, things going along that whole lake shed corridor. And I was able to meet a lot of archaeologists that were writing at that time. I was able to see a lot of unique things. So research that. That could be a great thing. You could also do career-based stuff, career nights. There's all kinds of spin-offs that you could do with that. So that's my pitch to you. And I'd like to hear from the attendees tonight. You know, what is your approach to archaeology in your classroom? Do you have the time? Do you do things? Do you just build it in when you can, like I mentioned? You know, what are the things that are important to you? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and let's see if we can get a few comments, and then Rich will talk about the database. Just give me a second here. Data collection for our database. So I am here, and let me see what we have for any questions. Let's see. So Andy, it says you are right. Students like those, meaning referring to, I'm assuming the hands-on type of stuff. Do not see any other questions. Anyone want to share what they do in the chat portion of what they do for archaeology? Any unique tips? Anything that you have done that would help participants in this session? All right, we have a comment. I do quite a bit with material culture objects in my classroom, figuring out function of objects. Absolutely. Some of my earliest lessons in the fall are bringing in all kinds of different things that students would have no clue, and getting them to manipulate those specific, I guess you'd call it, artifacts. Margaret, you want to jump in and say anything?
Well, I'm just realizing this very easy. Well, obviously with COVID, it's maybe not the best thing to be doing in the classroom, but eventually, one of the sort of fun ways that we would end the field school that I was supervisor on in England, they of course eat a lot of things like trifle, which are layered desserts, and you can get those sort of like how we have our pudding packs and our Jello packs, and they have layers in them. And so we were learning about stratigraphy, and stratigraphy being as deposition. So your oldest thing will be your Neanderthals and everything is here, and then the next layer in the ground will be the next oldest, so your Bronze Age and your Iron Age and your indigenous cultures, and then your contact period, and then 19th century and building up. And as we learned about the most recent, everyone would get to take off the first layer of their dessert and eat it. And like you'd have to do it. You couldn't just dig through your dessert. You had to scrape it off very, very slowly. And that's sort of a fun, I think, lesson for kids, because they of course like to eat snacks. It's a little bit harder maybe with food allergies and things like that, but any ways that you can think of like really interactive activities, especially around centered with food, once things get a little bit better, that's a very easy one to do. And I just remembered that we did that one.
Yeah, I think with the COVID stuff, as long as time goes on, I think those things could be reinstituted. But yeah, we always have to go through that lens and filter that. We also have in the chat, Andy's talking about working with Fort Clatsop, either in person or by Google Classroom. And those are the last two comments. I guess going once, going twice on anything you want to add on lessons that you do with kids. And yeah, I know some of the artifacts that if you were to do some hands-on stuff, you'd have to figure out some cleaning practices. But I think if you were able to have, there's so many different things you could bring in the fall where you wouldn't have to have a ton of groups touching, that same thing over and over, but you would have to figure that out. Well, we have Rich here. Rich is going to talk about the collections database. And I think both Margaret and Rich are going to talk about that. So you're on.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Let me just there. So everybody can see the web page for Fort Ticonderoga. So if you go to the home page, fortticonderoga.org, and if you click on the Learn and Explore menu bar and go down to Educators, and that'll take you to the Educator page, and there's a lot of different resources here, including if you're close enough and you want to book a field trip with us. We also do virtual outreach programs, and those are available anywhere. Our professional development opportunities, and be sure to check those out, especially in the next month or so as we get more details on our summer residential programs for 2022. Some lesson plans, micro courses, but where I wanted to go now is the Center for Digital History. And then there's more options. Some of them are the same, but then the Ticonderoga Online Collections Database, and connect there and search the collections. So there are various ways to use. Let's see, it's taken a little while to load. I will warn everybody, I have a daughter taking a graduate class right now, and I have another daughter running a Key Club meeting on Zoom. So we're taxing our broadband this evening at the house. This is the page for the Ticonderoga Online Collections Database. The best place to start is just keyword search. And I'm going to type in saucer and see what happens. And doesn't look like that's popping up. Oh, there it is. Just taking a little time. So there's lots of saucer up, and I'm not sure if I'm going to find how quickly the one we were looking at earlier with Margaret. So I'm just going to pick on this one. Looks like possibly Chinese export, which answers that question we were getting earlier. So Margaret, do you want to talk a little bit about, I see where it says undocumented on-site archaeological collection, what that means?
Yeah, so when we really started cataloging our archaeological material, when you bring objects into museums, sometimes when they're donated in like a large quantity from an individual, they'll get a collection name, and then sometimes you can give arbitrary collection names. But with our archaeological collections, we wanted to split them up between the collection that we have that was undocumented and on site. So material mostly that was found during the restoration period. So like 1909 to the 1930s, even further past that as well. So we know they're from the site, but we don't have any ground provenience for them, a ground location. And then we have a collection of documented on-site archaeological collections. So all that material from the Mars Education Center building era, so the late 1990s, early 2000s, and anything we find today is documented on site because that will have a location attached to it.
All right. Tim, do you have any suggestions for a different term to search?
Did you want to search the cartridge, the 26
Yeah, if you just
regiment
if you
box?
just do 26, it should pop up.
Okay. So my computer's a little slow because of all the activity at my house. Let's see.
And Rich, while you're searching that,
Oh, there it is.
There it is. Yep.
Okay.
Okay. And there we go. So that same undocumented, meaning it was found likely pre-1950 on site?
Yeah, this one I think was found probably in the like right around the restoration, the beginning of the restoration. So 1909 to maybe 1915. And this is a cartridge box plate from the 26th Regiment of Foot, which is really interesting in terms of a museum when we think of our education and our public history programming that we do. Our collections really are at the forefront of having a great influence, or I should say, not even influence, but they help bring forward the work that our public history department is doing. So this year they are actually portraying the 26th Regiment of Foot, who was at the fort in 1774 and 1775. So then we get to use the material culture, the artifacts that we're finding in the ground that come from our site that were used by the 26th Regiment of Foot to then help us build the portrayal that our staff, the clothing that they're wearing, we get to put these objects on exhibit, and everything just feeds back into each other. And it's really very exciting.
I know Miranda Peters, our Vice President of Collections and Digital Projects, would be happy for me to let you know as teachers that any of these images you can download and use in the classroom in PowerPoints or in other ways. The quality is high enough for that. They're just not usable for publication without going through the fort for reproduction rights. But any of these images from the collections database, you're more than welcome to download, use in the classroom, use on PowerPoints in ways like that. All right. Is there one more that kind of relates to what we've been talking about this evening?
You could show the patents if you wanted to.
Ah, yes. That was quick. So, Margaret, you've done a lot with these.
Yeah, these are one of my favorite archaeological artifacts that we have in the collection. They are they're the only items, I should say, I guess artifact or artifacts, because there's two of them, that are a definably female consumed or used object. So of course we have plates and bowls and utensils and things that could have been used by the wives of the officers or the wives of the soldiers in the army. They're referred to as followers, camp followers. But these objects, this pair of patens are made for women to use in the period. And these are the bottom of them. So in the context of our ground, we don't have in some areas a lot of water logging. So anything that's wood tends to decay really fast, whereas we get your shipwrecks, they stay really well because they're in a watery context. and an anaerobic environment, I should say. So we're missing the base, the top base of these, which is what a woman's foot or her shoe would rest on. And these would then help lift her up out of the muck and the grime. So there would have been a base for her to sit on. And then underneath that wooden shoe base is that metal ring oval that you see there. And these were found in the fort ruins. And these basically kept their women's shoes clean, and also maybe a little bit the bottoms of her dresses, but it was mostly for shoes because women's shoes in the period were mostly made out of fabric, especially if you had nice ones. So there's images of women washing floors or walking through the rain and the muck and all of the trash that would have been out on the streets. And this just kept their shoes clean. And this is from our fort, and they're just amazing.
All right. Thank you. I want to thank both Tim and Margaret. Margaret's been doing a lot of extra heavy lifting for teacher webinars, and she's got one more coming up with us, and we appreciate the time that you've taken to work with us. And I would like to thank Tim Potts, who, in addition to doing this, has a day job and has been very busy, like all of you. Even though we like to think COVID's in the rearview mirror, we know that it's not, and that it still has an impact on your teaching and everyday experience. I do want to let everyone know that we do have a webinar coming up that's really geared for pre-service teachers on November 9th. But other classroom teachers are more than welcome to join us if they're interested, and that's on November 9th, using historic objects with students. We found that the pre-service audience is really an underserved audience when it comes to getting beyond what they learn in social studies methods classes, and not really getting an opportunity to learn before they hit the classroom the importance of how to use historic documents, and even less so how to use historic objects. So we're looking forward to working with that group of pre-service teachers coming up in a couple weeks. I think that covers everything for this evening.
Rich, one more thing.
Yes, please.
This was a thing that I thought of during the talk. I had a spirited discussion. A student brought up a really important question today. So we're in my school district, we're allowed to use paper, but we're heavily pushed to keep our online presence going. We have to have both. We have to have both platforms, because if a student goes into quarantine, they have to be able to access live. They're able to see us live, but they're also able to access. And this student was really concerned about the gateway exam for New York as a Regents exam at the end of the year, and said, well, I know you kind of, at the beginning of the year, I did a lot of paper for the first couple of weeks, and I switched over. I said, I'm switching back over, and I've pretty much stayed online with my lessons within Teams. And kind of we're a one-to-one, so they all have a device. And she gave a very spirited defense about how the Regents exam will be on paper, and that teachers really need to practice throughout the year doing some paper stuff. And I said, yeah, great. So my point of that is, try to do some of those projects. If you're a middle school teacher, try to do some of those hands-on projects, because I have found that some of them, swear by the keyboard, but they want that tactile piece. And although I won't be making archaeology books with my 9th, 10th, and 11th graders this year, those of you that are in the middle school, you got plenty of options to do that hands-on stuff, depending on what you're allowed to. But the upshot was very spirited argument that the student, and I let her go. She was very good about it. And, let her go for 5 minutes explaining her views about how, in essence, they still have to write. So it's like music to my ears to hear that, because normally there would be this grunting and groaning about that, but look what COVID does. So that's my my little speech tonight.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. Again, thank you, Margaret. I know we have a couple New Englanders online who probably are eager for the baseball game coming up in a few minutes, as is Tim. We have at least one attendee from Texas. I don't know whether she's an Astro fan or not, but good luck to both sides. And thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at a future program. Somebody else booed the Red Sox, but we don't pay attention to Beck anyway. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
All right. Good night.